Hi, welcome to Quiet Before, a series devoted to unearthing anti-Asian violence and thinking about and looking at sort of how the community has responded to this moment of crisis. We gather here today in a time, my name's Huasu, by the way, and it's my honor to host today's discussion. We gather today in a time of crisis, but it's also a time of opportunity. We're seeing unprecedented spikes in reports of anti-Asian violence. We've all seen or heard about the videos, but at the same time, we're seeing new conversations, new attempts to imagine what solidarity or public safety might look like. To be sure, the actual activism, the work that people are doing on the ground, the organizing, it isn't unprecedented. It's been happening for decades, but perhaps the breadth and scale of these conversations are something that is new. I can't recall conversations about policing and state violence or gender-based violence drawing such a broad swath of our community. So we gathered today with leaders, folks who've been doing the work or organizing the streets in the community and government. This is a time of opportunity, and it's more important than ever to acknowledge the work that's being done today, the theme of the panel, if only to have a clearer picture of what remains needed and what needs to be done tomorrow and in the future, which is the subject of the panel on Thursday. Thanks to everyone out there who we cannot see for attending this series, especially this conversation tonight. If you have any questions, please feel free to email us at quietbefore2021@gmail.com, and we'll get the questions and hopefully circulate them among the panelists. Just a note, everyone's affiliations and hopefully links to their organizations should be down below on YouTube. So if you're interested in learning more about the work folks are doing, it shouldn't be too hard. So the way we're going to structure this conversation is we're going to sort of have these panels of 2 or 3 folks. I'm going to start with Kalayaan Mendoza, Director of U.S. Programs of Nonviolent Peace Force, Lolan Sevilla, culture worker and organizer and former board member of CAAAV, and Sasha Wijeyeratne, Executive Director of CAAAV, Organizing Asian Communities. Great to have you tonight. I wanted to talk to the 3 of you because a lot of your work is really engaging with direct response, mutual protection, sort of organizing on the ground. Where are we as a community? What are you seeing? How has the landscape or scope of your work changed these past few years? Perhaps we can start with Kalayaan.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Kalayaan Mendoza, and I'm speaking from the ancestral homelands of the Chettisakoin and Anishinaabe people, otherwise known as the Twin Cities, Minnesota. What we've seen in the last year has really been the pulling back of the curtain of violence that is deeply entrenched within this country. This country was founded on the enslavement of African people, on the genocide of Native Americans, and the continued exploitation of other communities of color. And I think all of us have been doing work around community care and mutual protection in a myriad of ways. And one thing that I really want to uplift is the fact that mutual care and mutual protection and community care are ancestral gifts that have been left to us by those that came before. This is a legacy that our ancestors have given to us, a legacy that has ensured their survival through colonization, through genocide, through subjugation. And as we're seeing right now in Palestine, in India, and here in the States, the fascism and ethno-nationalism, patriarchy, white supremacy are continuing to attack our communities, both on a structural and on an interpersonal level. The work that we do at Nonviolent Peace Force is supporting communities in building out their capacity on unarmed civilian protection. We all have this ability and we all have this background, especially for those of us that have been on the front lines fighting back against white supremacist violence. And I'll check there.
Great. I mean, it does seem like an incredibly fruitful time for us to really think about what we want as people, right? And in terms of notions of safety, public safety in particular, a term that just sort of gets tossed around a lot in very uncritical ways. Lolan, welcome.
Thanks so much, Wa. So I've been an organizer for like over half my life, and have served primarily LGBTQ plus, anti-violence movements, gender justice movements, and really the intersections between the communities that I've organized with is that, we've always been a target of violence. We've always, we've always been subject to hate violence. We've always been subject to discrimination and the many forms of violence that take shape. So in many ways, this isn't new to us. And I think one of the challenging things around the discourse is that, or one of the challenging and one of the opportunities is that we have a lot of folks who are now sort of understand, like being introduced in different ways to the ways that our communities are subjected to violence and want to get involved and want to really learn about what's going on. And I think that's awesome. I think that the social justice movement, the many different types of movements that our communities are a part of, welcome more people. And also, I think one of the challenge for folks who've been on the ground, who've been getting ourselves dirty, so to speak, is that that it's not new. And I think that sometimes that can be our challenge for the conversation, right? Of like people who have been in the trenches, people who know the types of violences, the systemic oppression that many folks, especially with marginalized, intersectional identities hold, are experiencing. And so I think for me as an organizer, thinking about how to adjust what political education looks like in this moment, what conversations need to be had with like aunties who've never, who've only seen me as a rabble rouser or seen me protesting the consulate on the news, are actually trying to have conversations around their safety for their family members, and really seeing this as a ripe opportunity to organize people that really haven't been open to organizing or open to having the conversations without, just being, kind of overtly critical or dismissive. So I think I'm holding that a lot for these conversations, for what is happening in the movement right now, and seeing it very much as an opportunity for all of us to really bring in more voices than we haven't seen before, and to connect with those of us who experience firsthand, day to day, what harms, what violence is just sort of always present when stepping outside our homes. Thank you. I'll pause there.
That's such a critical point you bring up, the fact that a lot of the work being done, the activism, that political impulse, it's not new, right? But it's perhaps the idea that we can now like radicalize onto, right? That there's a way in which there's conversations that are really more robust, questions being asked that have never been asked before. It's a really exciting time. And I think it's always key to hold on to sort of organizations that have been doing the work for quite a long time. And in my mind, an organization like CAAAV it's a legendary organization. Like I feel like ever since I turned 18, I've looked up to CAAAV. So Sasha, can you tell us a bit about what you're seeing as the director of CAAAV?
Yes, and that is quite a setup. Thank you all so much for having us, and thanks to folks for organizing this panel. CAAAV has been around for a long time. We've been around since the 80s, and I was not part of the work then, but one of the lessons that we have as an organization is that CAAAV started in response to individual acts of hate violence. The most sort of well-known one being the murder of Vincent Chin. And over time, CAAAV's analysis has been that actually we can't address each individual act of hate violence as they come up, right? It's like running around trying to put out a fire that's burning way out of your control. And it burns people out, it burns communities out, it burns organizers out. And so I think one of the lessons that we hold that I think like is useful in this moment is that we moved from addressing individual acts of hate violence to addressing systemic issues, right? Which right now means housing. And on the surface, those don't seem connected. How is organizing for housing justice in Chinatown and Western Queens, how is that connected to anti-Asian hate or to hate violence? And I think what we know as an organization, what's sort of in our DNA, is that the more that we organize for economic security, for people to have the lives that they need, the homes that they need, jobs with dignity, lives with dignity, that's actually what's at the core of a lot of this violence, right? A lot of the people who've been targeted are folks who've had jobs where they have to leave their homes during a pandemic and go to serve people, often middle-class white people, right? And that's what's putting them at risk, both of violence in the pandemic, which gets sort of lost in this conversation really easily, but also risk of hate violence. And so I think that's one piece from the many years of CAAAV that feels worth bringing back into this moment, is that we can't stop at thinking about what we call hate violence. We have to actually think about and address the ways that white supremacy and patriarchy and violence are built into the fabric of the state in the US, and how we begin to undo and unearth and untangle that. And then one other piece I will add is that, and I think folks have said this already, that often the conversation that we're having is at the level of activists, right? Who have all the right language and know what to say and know the lingo and know what not to say. And that sometimes we lose our patience when we talk to, like Lolan was saying, the aunties, right? Who maybe kind of want the police right now because they're terrified of leaving their homes. And that's the only option that we've presented as safety. And so I think there's also something in, we organize working class Asian immigrants in Chinatown and Western Queens and rent stabilized in public housing. And those are debates that we have, right? We have people saying, like, the police haven't been good to us. Actually, sometimes they've been really violent. Actually, they evicted my friend, but I don't know who else to call. And so I kind of want them to be posted up in Chinatown, right? And those have been debates within our membership. And it's not where we've landed as an organization or as members, but it's been important to have the space where people can say that and to actually engage people in that conversation and not immediately dismiss people who aren't seeing other options because those options don't exist at scale, to not immediately dismiss them as being unworthy of our movements. And I think that's another kind of lesson in this moment, is that we can't just talk to each other, right? We have to be having these conversations not in English. We have to be having them with folks who aren't going to say all the right things all the time. We can't dismiss, and sometimes people don't change immediately, right? There are some people who are committed to not changing, and that's different. But there are some people where it will take months and years of having the same conversation. And we aren't big enough right now to build the world that we want. We can't build a world right now that doesn't have anti-Asian violence, where there are no police, where our communities are funded instead of the cops. We don't have the power. And if we're serious about building that power, we actually need almost everybody who we can convince to be on our side, right? And so that means committing to really hard conversations with people who may at some point seem like they'll never agree with us, but putting in the work and slowly building people. And I think that's something at CAAAV, that's why we're a member-based organization, we're a membership organization. And so there isn't a political line that folks have to meet to join, right? We have a political line as an organization. We're building an Asian immigrant left. We're clear about that, but you don't have to immediately believe that to join, right? We're committed to bringing in people as they are, and then working with folks and developing each other and learning from each other and moving us to be in a different place and moving us to take different positions. So I'll leave it at that.
It's so important what you just said, how that's the difficult work of organizing, of activism, is not just finding your team, but also convincing other people to join. Lolan, Kalayaan, you sort of mentioned that as well, just that there's a way in which we need to engage with Auntie. We need to sort of be able to educate people as we're sort of bringing them along with us. I'm wondering, when someone asks you, like, what can I do? People are really enthused to join the social justice movement. Like, how do you approach those situations? How do you, Kalayaan?
I would recommend that folks check out Deepa Iyer's work. I'm really glad to be on this panel with Deepa. Social change ecosystem has really been instrumental in having folks find their positionality in ways that are accessible and that meet their experience levels. We all have a place in movement work, whether it's relationship building, whether it's being a frontline responder, whether it is being a storyteller. I think a lot of times, unfortunately, in at least in the very recent, last 10 years, really, I think people are more focused, have been more focused on mass criticism rather than building mass movement. And it comes from a place of trauma, and that needs to be recognized. But we can radically love one another and be gentle one another. And whenever there's a new person who's like, I don't identify as an activist, but I want to do something. I think looking at Deepa's work on the social change ecosystem and doing an assessment of their self about how they want to show up for their communities, what are their capacities, because everyone, like I said, everyone has a place in the movement, and we don't all have to be at the front lines, taking tear gas in the face, and that's just not the reality. Folks can be, working from behind a screen, building pods of, survival pods of within their communities. They can be supporting one another and holding space for each other, in a holistic way. So I just hope, and I want to invite folks that are watching this that are wondering to really do, find out for yourself how you want to show up, what your capacity is, and seek out the resources that can help guide you.
I think to build upon Kalayaan is, I think when people think of social justice movements in a popular context, there's a tendency to think of it as a monolith, that social justice movements only look one way, of like, taking the streets and, a particular there are all kinds of associations. And that's one way to enter it. And I think it serves its purpose, and I'm hella down for it. And to Kalayaan's point, that there are many entry points that you can make that feels right for where you're at. I think one of the things I love about organizing in particular, and organizing within AAPI communities, is that it's all about relationships, right? It's about not who you know, but that just on this panel, I have folks that I've worked with in various capacities, lots of respect, and I think that tends to be, for me, what being a part of the movement means, is that I'm connected to other people. I'm connected to communities that aren't just where I'm from, like people holding identities different from mine, and I think that's one of the crucial things that folks really need to think about like getting involved, is that it is about building community. It's about building connection, and it starts from there. What else? There's something else I was going to say. But solidarity is one of the crucial things about building movements, and meeting folks where there are. So I love that. I'm going to check out social change ecosystem and Deepa's work. But our community has such a wealth of resource across the country. And I use our community very, very broadly, but anywhere you are, there's a Chinatown. Anywhere you are, there's a Filipino community center. There are community centers. There are organizations that are already there. And it's just about, sometimes it's easy as doing a Google search. Sometimes I've met particular activists who think that they have to start a whole new thing once they sort of have their come to I'm gonna say come to Jesus, but that's the only thing that's coming to my mind right now. So apologies. But you know, folks think that they have to start something new, and a lot of times there's just a wealth of resource already there that is just waiting for folks to find and plug in. And you know, everyone has in their families that radicalized cousin or auntie, that queer like person, someone who's connected to some other community. And I think it's using that like sort of you know, kind of organizing 101 tenet about like connecting with the relationships we already have and building from there. I'll pause.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I'm very much struck with the you know, there's so much wisdom in this room. And I think one thing that I was thinking about earlier when Sasha was talking about the work of CAAAV is linking, say, housing with hate violence, right? And the ways in which one wouldn't think that gentrification and protecting people's housing rights links to these larger issues, which I think have brought a lot more visibility to the work that everyone here is doing. Now, I'd love to turn to Alena and Deepa. Alena Victor is the Chief Program Officer of Womankind. Deepa Iyer is activist, lawyer, author, and I encourage everyone to check out the work that Kalayaan mentioned, because I think both of you have this perspective on these ways in which like one thing doesn't begin and one thing doesn't end, the other thing begins, like everything is sort of implicated together. You know, Alena, one thing that Womankind is really committed to is working around this question of why community-based violence is part of the gender-based violence narrative and why this connection is necessary. I was wondering if you'd speak a bit to that issue.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having me in this space. I wanted to start off by saying I'm a New Yorker raised, but definitely was born in another country. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is recognizing that a lot of my history has a lot of gendered lenses around it. And so that's the intentionality within which I do my work. And the things that I've learned over the years and working within Womankind and also working within the platform of New York City and having the privilege of working within a very urban environment like New York City is that concept of looking at violence from a gendered lens is crucial. Gender-based violence in its reality sits within that concept of hate being present within an environment. And the environment can be a home environment where partner violence is happening or family violence is happening, but it can just as easily move into a community lens. So when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about this from the standpoint of, I started off as a counselor, as a social worker, doing counseling work, working individually with families and recognizing how violence was prevalent within the home environment and the trauma and the ripple effects of that trauma, not only on that one generation, but the intergenerational impact of that. And then recognizing that violence then ripples into community levels, right? How many of our communities engage in a patriarchal structure where gender norms are continued to be maintained, where certain gender identities are subjugated and marginalized, whereas other gender identities are uplifted, patriarchal, predominantly men, predominantly cis men. And I come from a culture that uplifts that. And looking at community-based violence, there's those similar threads of who is allowed to be in the role of power and who's not allowed to be in the role of power and who's consistently subjugated and oppressed. And then it goes back to thinking about not just this in like verbal harassment, physical assault, sexual violence and sexual violence on women, and the concept of rape being a weapon of war in some of our communities, and constant subjugation of women and forced sterilization, forced reproductive impact in the United States, for example, when we're talking about abortion rights and the fact that rules can be made to basically say that a woman's body is somebody else has control over women's bodies and reproductive rights. These are all constructs that are consistently oppressing one groups of individuals, gender identities that are marginalized. And thinking about it from a gendered lens, from the work we do on a daily basis, if we don't get involved, if we don't think about community-based violence as a part of this work, then we're kind of siloing out this concept of violence. We only tackle violence. And I think Sasha said this, we're tackling it in silos without recognizing that if we don't look at the larger umbrella impact of why this violence is existing, why these systems are consistently in place, and why communities of color are predominantly targets of these systems, then what are we really trying to accomplish? And I think that solidarity work around really looking at communities of color, looking at all of our different forms of marginalizations, how they've impacted all of us, and come together and look at that and really kind of deconstruct and work within that, and calling our communities in, especially like I heard Kalayaan, I heard Lolan, I heard Sasha say that our communities are not going to understand that logic or that very intellectualized understanding of why these structures exist. But if we can break it down, if we can say, this is what safety means for you, and this is how safety can, doesn't have to necessarily include police. These are alternatives that are available to us. And these are other things we can kind of do to support your well-being, my well-being, our community's well-being. Then maybe we can move in a direction where collective understanding and collective work can happen. And I'll pause there.
You know, it's so important to hold on to those broader contexts, I think, particularly when we're often motivated or the visibility arises around these like flashpoints or moments that are like very visible, like these videos that have been circulating. And yet, I think what you're really pressing us to do is to hold on to these broader contexts and sort of not be afraid to call people in or sort of interrogate what these questions mean. You know, I'm very curious, like Deepa, in your work, you're very focused on sort of holding on to these, the role of the historical, these broader contexts. I know right now you're working on projects around the 20th anniversary or commemorating the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And can you talk a bit about how you see this work fitting into these broader questions?
Yes, it's so great to be in community with all of you and to learn from you. And thank you to Nancy, Cal, and also just recognizing that the series is in memory of people like Corky Lee. So wanted to bring folks into space as well. Yeah, I guess I can share a little bit about sort of the anniversary of September 11th. And I know that 9/11 and its impact brings up a lot of different emotions in people. And what I'm talking about is really limited to my perspective of having worked in South Asian Arab, Muslim, and Sikh communities after 9/11 for about 15 years. But I can share kind of 3 themes that are coming up for me as part of this conversation. And, you know, well, when you started off, you started talking about crisis, right? And I think one of the things that I would say is that crisis moments have long arcs. And that is the case with 9/11 and its impact it has had, and it continues to have a long arc, right? So in terms of the intergenerational trauma that folks are dealing with, whether we came of age in that moment, as I did, or whether people were born and raised in the shadow of that moment, as many others have been, we still deal with that. And so I think a lot about the effects of both hate violence and state violence on our communities that has been utilized and reproduced against other communities as well. So a lot of this is the importance of remembering and the importance of also understanding how it continues to play out, right? So when we think of hate violence, we think of people being profiled on planes. We think of attacks against Sikh uncles and Muslim women. We think about how our mosques and gurdwaras and temples that were our safe spaces have been vandalized. We think of all of that happening right after 9/11, but also continuing. Right? When you think of Park 51, when you think of the attack at the Oak Creek Gurdwara in 2012, when you even think of what has happened today, just a month ago in Indianapolis with the shooting targeting Sikh American workers, right? State violence also has had an arc and an impact on our communities. We know that the entire infrastructure of the Department of Homeland Security was created in the wake of 9/11, and how national security and immigration policies not only affected communities right after 9/11 with programs like NSEERS and the Alien Absconder Initiative, but have continued to the Muslim ban and other policies that we see today. So I think it's really important to understand that these crises moments can lead to hate violence and state violence targeting historically marginalized communities and have an impact and a thread that lasts many, many years since. And that is, I think, what we are dealing with today. And then the other point I'll quickly make is while that has happened, those crisis moments have happened and continue to have an impact on us, community building and solidarity and power building have been the strategies that have really helped us to deal with and address and meet these crises points. So, in the wake of 9/11, what you saw when you looked at the South Asian Arab Muslim Sikh landscape is vastly different than what it is today, right? And so now, we have advocacy groups, we have organizing groups, we have direct service groups, we have networks and coalitions that have come together. And we had to do that to respond to the crisis in order to survive, right? So I think that, and then we've dealt with a lot of sticky points too. When we built these kinds of coalitions, we dealt with the sticky point about whether South Asians actually are part of the Asian American ecosystem or whether we're part of the AMEMSA one, the Arab Muslim South Asian one, right? We dealt with the role of Black Muslims in the entire landscape of this work. We have dealt with how we deal with what is happening internationally in places, and I appreciate Khara bringing in Palestine and India. All of that affects our communities here too. So I think that the crises have a long arc, and community building and solidarity are the interventions, are the two things I would sort of bring up.
I'm glad you raised this question of the diversity within this category that we're talking about, and sort of the importance of interrogating and sort of putting stress on the category of Asian American AAPI, if only to reaffirm it, hopefully, or to kind of think about it in new lights. I want to bring in Khara. Khara Jabola-Carolus is the executive director of the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women. Now, you're coming to us from Hawaii, right, which is a colonial outpost. It's an Asian and Pacific Islander majority state, which is sort of a different context, I would say, than some of the other contexts we've discussed. How does that composition shape the contours of anti-Asian violence, and how these questions of violence, particularly against women, take shape in Hawaii?
Okay, so yeah, you're right. We're a Native Hawaiian and Asian majority state, but white folks are still the plurality here. And not just that, but we as a colony are a place where white Americans were recruited to replace Native Hawaiians and Asians because Native Hawaiians and Asians were seen as unfit to govern and only fit to serve white people. And so those stereotypes are needed to keep Asians and Native Hawaiians, in their place, out of power, and serving white power, and making all that seem logical. So even though, I think some people say the police are the solution, some people say the police are the problem, but although we have to abolish the police, blaming the police or the military alone is like blaming bullets for the gun. We have to do much deeper work, because the source of anti-Asian and specifically anti-Asian and anti-women violence is much deeper. So, it's not just colonization and imperialism, but it's also patriarchy. It's also, capitalism, which I, think is really one common project with white supremacy. And for us in Hawaii, how we see violence, one of the pillars of capitalism and its parent system is the sex trade. Hawaii has one of the most overactive sex trades in the United States and most violent. And that's really where you see, a source site of our dehumanization. I like to say I'm half Asian, but I'm a whole ass stereotype because my mom is Filipina and my dad was military. And we know that the sex trade really defines who we are able to be in the minds of groups that position themselves as superior to us. And so, you know, for us in Hawaii, one of the things that we've done, we are absolutely committed to the immediate decriminalization of women and gender diverse people. But we know that full decriminalization of the sex trade is the weakest, least ambitious, and least visionary solution that we can come up with. We cannot fight dehumanization with dehumanization. And so, you know, we won't find our liberation through free market enterprises that sell gendered racist stereotypes of our people. So we created the first feminist economic recovery plan. Shout out to the Asian and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander and Micronesian women who created that from a government in the United States. So that's just a snippet of what we're doing. And we're so glad to be in conversation with everybody. Thank you.
Oh, it's incredible to think about the scope and vision that involves. You know, I really want to bring in Vanessa and Carmelyn. You know, we hear a lot about the ideas of like leadership and vision. We hear a lot about representation, and we can recognize the weak version of representation, right? I think we all are familiar with what that looks like in its most kind of banal form. You know, I'm curious, you know, Vanessa Leung is co-executive director of the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families, Carmelyn Malalis, chair and commissioner of the New York City Commission on Human Rights. Carmelyn, I'd love to start with you. Can you speak about how your work is sort of engaging with these questions of representation, ensuring there's not just an accurate accounting of the community, but what this means for our next generation of leaders who can hopefully like execute a lot of the visions and ideas that we've heard about thus far?
Sure. You know, and I want to again thank everyone for being here tonight and for putting on this program and creating this space. I think your question really pulls from a lot of the answers that folks have already shared with us tonight. It's coming in this later in the program. There's like so much you want to kind of pull into or respond to that other people have already said. I think the question of representation is kind of an exciting one right now. The fact that all of us, frankly, are here coming from our different perspectives, our different communities, our different family stories, with the kind of personal lived experience, but then also with the professional knowledge and spaces that we occupy is incredibly exciting, you know, on its own. For me, you know, representation has been very important as a person in local government. This was my first time in local government. My background is as an employment attorney, but certainly for me, part of the lure to coming into government, especially local government that controls such, you know, basic and crucial parts of people's lives, you know, access to education, access to housing, access to healthcare, really basic human needs, but again, very much controlled at the local level and very much at the whims of whoever, you know, is the principal or the person controlling whatever your local government is. We have all come, you know, we're all coming out of what I think was a really horrific time for human rights, looking at it on the federal level in this country, where on the federal level, we saw in many of our communities, human rights in different forms, whether it's, in the form of anti-Blackness or transphobia or homophobia or anti-Asian racism, religious attacks on our religious communities. We all saw and experienced ways in which the federal government, because of who was in power at that time, trying to contract human rights, trying to redefine it, trying to limit it, and in many situations, trying to actually erase whole communities. I think we've all, you know, learned a very deep lesson on what it means and how important it is to make sure that the people that you are voting into government, you know, and I say this at a time when we just went through a change at the federal level. Here in New York City, we're going to be heading into our very crucial primary time and then our elections in November. But remembering how very crucial and important it is to be thinking about who you're voting for and who's in there. The fact, I think, that I am an Asian American woman, the fact that I'm a lesbian, that I have a wife who's an immigrant from Ethiopia. It's no mistake to me that if you look at the past few years where I've been head of the Commission on Human Rights, a lot of our work has been focused on bringing out the issues that that many, hidden or non-resource communities in the past really had not had very much of a platform for. And again, I think because of histories of over-policing or over-surveillance, lack of communication or relationship with government, I think it does take people from community to be in government, not just representing those different communities, but also allowing those communities to come forward and create relationship with government. Why should anyone come forward if their history is that of over-policing? Why should anyone come forward and ask for anything at the Commission on Human Rights if their only experience with government was negative or was non-responsive? Having diverse diverse staffs at city agencies is incredibly important. When I think about the work we do day in and day out addressing discrimination and harassment related claims, some of the most common barriers to people coming forward include things like language, right? Disability related barriers, cultural competency related barriers. And if you're forward thinking, actually trying to address them before they create that barrier, you're actually able to reach the communities that need the help the most, that so often are cut off from the resources of government because of those very common barriers. I mean, we still deal with it quite a bit because there's a lot, I think, of relationship building and mending to do, right, between government and different groups, especially immigrant groups. But it also, I think, is a really wonderful way that, we can be thinking within whatever community we're in about how our struggles, how our, fight for human rights, how it corresponds with, relates, and rises and diminishes with those same rights, those same fights for human rights within other communities. What I think is also really exciting right now, especially in New York City, is we're seeing the ways in which, people are focused on looking at the intersections and looking more at solidarity truly in action. So how does my fight against anti-Asian racism, how does that correspond with, how is that very much connected with fights against anti-Blackness? How do we look within our own communities to address the anti-Blackness that we've had to, some of us grew up with, some of us have struggled with it in our own communities, in our own families, and how do we use those lived experiences in the work we're doing when we're talking about not just fighting against anti-Asian racism, but when we're fighting against anti-Blackness or we're anti-Muslim hatred or any of the other issues that we've been seeing, I think, become more part of our conversations in the past few years.
Vanessa, I'd love to bring you in and sort of flesh out kind of what it means to understand where the community's needs are at and how your organization is working towards that.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, CACF, the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families, we are a Pan-Asian children's policy advocacy organization, and we are actually really intentional about bringing the diverse Asian American community, meaning the South Asian, the Southeast Asian, and East Asian communities to really fight for equity for Asian American New Yorkers. I mean, since 1986, we've been focused on advocating for equity and opportunity for marginalized Asian New Yorkers, focused really on systems change. How do we transform our communities for the better? And we know we need to do that in order to be effective, that we have to actually have strong community leaders, that we have to have strong community organizations, and that we really can't do this on our own. We really believe that it is important that we each could play a role in how we bring better systems, better policies and resources to our communities, and that it's not that we just need a few shining stars and a few folks who who could really be vocal for our community, but we need a full constellation of our leaders working together and in alignment to address really long-term inequities. I mean, I think what we've seen from our membership is that they've had to do so much more at the height of COVID and now through the recovery. They're the ones that have been on the front lines translating outreach materials and information and rights to healthcare, or navigating the websites because our government was slow to do the translations or weren't able to reach the many low density languages that our community speaks. They've had to really help families stay safe as they live in overcrowded housing, or addressing the rise in domestic violence and supporting families that were living in fear of uncertainties of essential work, about lost jobs, deportations, comforting families that were in mourning. They really then had to, as they were seeing this, addressing the fears of communities as hate crime and hate incidents reporting increased, so that they knew where to go for help. But I think what we were working together is ensuring that this is what everybody has said, are things that we have to look at the root causes, that the solutions that we bring forward have to be centered on redefining what safety means, like safety meaning the presence of wellness for our communities and communities across New York City and across the country. And that work has to be done in coalition, in alignment with other communities. Every day, I feel like CCF, and I feel like this is for decades, has always had to do the work about dispelling the model minority myth. And the model minority myth has, we have to acknowledge that it actually erases the struggles of our community. If you're a model minority, that means you don't need those help, you don't need those resources. You're almost shouldn't be sharing that you have struggles, but we also know that the model minority has been used to justify underinvestments in other communities of color. The work that we need to do is looking closely and having those really hard conversations about how we can show up for other communities as well. I think we need to see the connections between what the xenophobia and the racist rhetoric and the violence that we're seeing that's really created a heightened level of anxiety and fear in our community, that all stems from really the same deep-rooted patterns of racism that have created the inequities that were exacerbated by COVID-19. And we have to see that the Asian American community has been used in a lot of ways. The fact that we've had people in power, have really no qualms of scapegoating an entire people for a health crisis, or use as rendering us as perpetual foreigners on one hand, and then at sometimes lauding us as the model minority. We need to acknowledge that that's how white supremacy prevails, right? And so it is around helping our communities have these conversations, that it's not about simply fighting our erasure from conversations, when we don't have disaggregated data and we're seen as a monolith, or not seen at all. But it's also understanding that fight is not just about our community's visibility, but really dismantling white supremacy culture that really has allowed and created the model minority myth to impact us all.
The model minority myth is certainly something that is often used, as you pointed out, as a wedge between Asian Americans and other communities. Quite a few of you have brought up questions of coalition building, of solidarity, building new systems, showing up for other communities. We've had a couple questions from the audience. When we talk about coalition building, when we talk about solidarity, what does that look like? Because from the perspective of some folks who are watching, watching what we're talking about right now, a lot of the anti-Asian violence is perpetrated by other people of color, right? And so when we talk about white supremacy, when we're using a term like that, it's not necessarily, like people in hood, like Klansmen in hoods, right? So I guess how for all of you are you sort of pursuing these questions? Like, how are you reckoning with this idea of how anti-Asian violence is also, the root causes that Vanessa was talking about is something that we need to hold on to. How do you do that in your own work? And how do you sort of do the work of educating others and sort of hearing what they're saying and sort of figuring out how to square that seeming contradiction?
I can start us off and then kick it to whoever wants to. So one piece is that I think sometimes we talk about solidarity as these two really distinct and different communities who have no interaction with each other coming together to support, right? So we talk about Asians for Black Lives, and it's often kind of middle-class activist Asian folks coming and saying like, okay, this isn't our day-to-day life, but we're coming to show up in solidarity. And that's a beautiful thing. And it's also not the reality for the folks who we work with, right? So when we organize working class Asian people, like Asian and Black folks are neighbors, right? Especially in public housing, that's true. And so when people are coming together in solidarity, it's both, and I sort of like building an analysis of coming together in solidarity against anti-Blackness, and it's also coming together because we all need public housing to not get torn down and made into and privatized, right? It's because we're all actually fighting for the same things side by side with each other. And that being the basis for solidarity, when then things happen that impact Black tenants, but not our Asian members, that basis for solidarity is really different, right? It's based on having fought side by side as comrades in the same fights for the same material resources. And I think that's one piece about sort of solidarity that sometimes gets lost when we only see certain kinds of activism that often are the more like glitzy and the things that get into the media. And again, it's not to hate on any of that, it's all important, but it's not the only kind of solidarity work that exists. And then I think to the second piece of, a lot of the anti-Asian violence is coming from other people of color communities. I think one piece with our members is that sometimes that's happening because those are the folks who are neighbors, right? And often when people feel disempowered and, COVID is stealing people's lives, stealing people's work, stealing people's homes, like that anger is all going somewhere. And sometimes it comes out against people's neighbors. And I think what we've been asking members and asking ourselves is like, but what's actually at the cause of that violence, right? It doesn't make sense to say, well, that person is the root cause when they've are at risk of eviction and just lost their job and their grandma just died from COVID, right? Who's actually at the cause is Trump, for instance, saying like, oh, it's a China virus, that's who we should blame, right? What's actually at the cause is white supremacy and capitalism needing to blame someone for the crisis that we're in, because actually they can't say it's because we've mismanaged this and we put profit over people and that's why everyone's dying, right? So I think it's hard to get there when people are in a place of trauma, but that's the conversation that we need to have. And that's how we can move from like who's hurting who to who's actually causing this. Who's actually causing this violence to happen, and violence in all of its different forms.
I think some of the conversations too that have been happening in communities about, what does community safety look like, or what are alternatives to what we've lived, like what different kind of penal or carceral regimes that we've lived under, what are the alternatives to that, so that we're not looking just at the one incident of hate or the one incident of hate violence that has happened, but what has allowed it to happen in community? What are the underlying relationships that have existed for years or for decades that have allowed certain things to happen? I think it's really exciting that we're seeing API communities that are very diverse and also intergenerational starting to ask these questions. One of the questions I think that really sticks with me when I'm in the space of looking at or addressing these questions from a more restorative model is this question of, what did I, just as another person in community, what did I fail to do to have allowed this to happen, right? And I think that we're finding more and more in community as people are thinking through what are some alternatives to what we've done in the past? What are the alternatives to just demanding that something be investigated as a hate crime? What are the alternatives to just looking at that one incident to say, who should be punished because of this one incident, and instead say, as I think Sasha was also referring to, what is happening around us that is causing this to happen? What is happening in our neighbors or in other communities' lives, institutionally and otherwise, to have allowed this to happen? And what is my place in making the changes necessary so that it doesn't continue to happen?
Oh, go ahead, Deepa.
You can, Vanessa, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I was just, I think what we're talking about is looking at, as well as what Sasha and Carmelyn has mentioned, is these connections to communities already, and how those connections can be strengthened. But I think the reality is that we have to acknowledge that what racism and what white supremacy culture has taught many of us, or what folks have internalized, is who's defined as fully human. And when we don't have those real connections in community, we have to just acknowledge that kind of white supremacy culture is actually insidious and poisons folks across our communities. And so it is this work that we need to do about naming it and calling it and working together to address racism and dismantle kind of systems of oppression together, and be actively part of that process with other communities.
I totally agree with what everyone has said. I just wanted to make a couple of points. I think it's important to question some of our assumptions. I'm not entirely sure that most of the perpetrators that are committing anti-Asian hate are other people of color. And I think it's important, there are videos that go around that say something, right? But we don't have the data, we don't have the statistics. And I think we should be careful about that, especially when we recognize that the primary threat in this country is actually white supremacists. And, we saw that in January in full view, right? Not far from where I live. And so I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind. The second piece, as others have said, is that Black and Asian communities have always been pitted against each other. And it's not surprising, right? When you think of affirmative action fights, when you think of any sort of access to public benefits. And so it is so important to really think about the root causes of why people are distressed, why people are angry, why people don't trust each other. It's because people don't have access to and are having to fight each other for basic benefits like housing and jobs and healthcare. And so addressing, just as Sasha said, the root causes, the system, is what we need to do rather than fight each other, right? We need to fight white supremacy, not each other. And then the final thing I'll say is I think there are so many examples of how Black and Asian communities are building solidarity in really meaningful ways. I think of folks, for example, in Minnesota, who have been pulling together, right, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, where there was another a Hmong police officer also at that horrible murder site, and how organizations like the Coalition of Asian American Leaders there really made some strong statements about Black liberation. I think about folks in Oakland who in Black and Asian communities have come together to identify community-based solutions that really fit their communities and actually address the root causes and are really advocating with city officials and legislators. So I think that there are these examples that we can also turn to really understand how we're building meaningfully in our communities across communities as well.
If I may add to what I think I heard Deepa and Vanessa say, is along with recognizing the divisiveness that maybe has been pitted on communities of color, it's also taking a deep dive understanding of how our communities have benefited from the model minority myth and continue to benefit from that myth, and then how it is that within how we raise our children or how we within our communities socialize ourselves around communities of color that exist around our neighborhoods, right? In an urban environment, I grew up in Harlem. and what I was taught while I was raised around other racial groups are things that I'm fighting against even to this day, right? And it's that ongoing internal work that is also needs to be a part of this work. How are we looking at our Asian identities and how we look at other communities of color, and where are the roots of that racism coming from as well? Why are we engaging in those kind of conversations in our households, around in the kitchen table, right? On holidays, what's that about? And how is that household related interaction, communication, then having a ripple effect within the communities that we then go out to, go to the bodega or go to the supermarkets? How is that having that ripple effect on the community? And then how does that grow from there? I think sometimes it's important to look at the micro and how the micro impacts the macro over time, and the ripple effect and the structure that creates.
I just want to throw in, all of that resonated, and I second it, but I don't quite want to let men of color off the hook. I don't quite want to let Asian men off the hook. And I think that we do need to talk about masculinity and the pressure that our men face to live up to and perform white manhood and their position under it. Because during, the Great Recession and now, we're seeing a massive increase in violence against women of color, including Asian and Pacific Islander women. And the majority of, those who are enacting violence and using them as their punching bag, as Jordan Saito, one of my favorite activists here, said during COVID, it falls along gender and racial lines, and we can't tease out the sexist stereotypes, the misogyny from the racism and the racialized stereotypes there. The majority of Asian and Pacific Islander women who have been killed during COVID were killed by Asian men. And Filipinos, unfortunately, are the largest group of those who kill their partners, female partners, in Hawaii, and it's not proportional to our numbers in the population. So this is a serious component to it, and I just wanted to, just elevate that too.
I just wanted to touch on what some of the threads that folks have been weaving around solidarity. I think it's really important to also name that, solidarity is power with, not power over. And one of the really, really helpful resources that I've found is Daisy's Rising Up and Moving in New York City has created this amazing breakdown. It's called the 4 Levels of Solidarity. And I think it's really important for us when we're thinking about how do we show up for one another, is to look at moving from just symbolic to transformational solidarity. And in that, the question around how to address, as Deepa was saying, like it's kind of a narrative that it's against a Black and Asian community. But for folks that are wondering, how do we even engage in that? It's like, as Lolan was saying, start building relationships with your neighbors. Start really getting to know who are the folks that are in your area. I know that's super basic, but I think a lot of times we are cut off from that. And that is something that many of our cultures still hold very dear, is a sense of communalism, the sense of deep connection. The work that Nonviolent Peace Force does in Iraq, in South Sudan and Philippines and Myanmar is really about centering relationship building as a way to reimagine what safety looks like outside of the construct of a white settler colonial, or really like white settler approaches. And in that, I want to invite folks, if you're in New York City, to come to the Blasian March, the Black, Asian, and Blasian March on June 5th. You can find out more information on Instagram. It's organized by Rohan Julie and a collective of other Black and Asian folks that are really wanting to uplift what solidarity can look like, especially from what Grace Lee Boggs and Dr. Angela Davis called to us to do, which is like visionary organizing. And lastly, I just want to just give appreciation to Khara about naming the some of the the painful shit that, excuse my language, the very real violence that happens within our communities, and we do need to be held accountable, and we do need to find out ways that I, as a cis man, need to call out gendered violence within my community. So yeah, check.
I also just want to throw out there, when we're talking about solidarity, I think some of the more complicated conversations I've seen roll out as a result of not addressing root causes and the ways that white supremacy culture and the model minority myth sort of weave into the conversation around like supporting the perfect victim, right? We only support victims or survivors who look a particular way, right? And so when you have people with identities that maybe folks can't identify with, people who are part of survival economies, people who are transgender, people who, right? So how compounded that is that I've seen people dismiss support and solidarity when people don't have identities that mirror their own, or that are just complicated by intersectional identities or complicated lives, right? And so I think that the more we can have nuanced conversations around what solidarity looks like, and that solidarity can look different ways at different times, and that a huge piece of solidarity is, unlearning our own stuff. That is the hardest part around, has been the hardest part for me as an organizer who's been doing this work in a lifetime, for a lifetime, like unlearning the ways that I've, unconsciously absorbed patriarchy, or the ways that, my education has created barriers for my understanding different lives, or, so I think that, it's about complicating the conversation in ways that allow us to move beyond our own perspectives and lenses.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think this set of answers really did wonders in terms of kind of complicating the terms of what it is we're doing in order to hopefully reaffirm a commitment to it, and to do it kind of, with virtue and with thoughtfulness. This question of unlearning that Lolan just brought up, I think is one that a lot of the audience members are sort of puzzling over. It's kind of what it would mean for us to reckon with anti-Blackness within our own communities, what it means to sort of talk through the legacies of conflicts that have happened in the past. I'm wondering, and this is, a broader question might be like, what is missing in our movements right now, and how do our movements need to adapt? I think we are, at least on this panel, very, very open to the idea of talking about these conflicts, but how sort of on a broader scale should our movements and our ways of thinking adapt? And you can even talk about sort of ways in which your own work or your own approach to work has changed over the past 3 or 4 years. Yeah, Carmelyn.
I'm going to kind of chime in, not hitting your question directly, but something that I think is very connected, which is that especially I think among AAPI communities and families, and along with the idea of unlearning our own stuff, I think that there is a lot that we collectively suffer through intergenerationally. At the beginning, I think you mentioned one of the big questions is the challenges that we have in our work or in movement building that happen because of intergenerational conflicts or intergenerational challenges. My office does a lot of work with different youth populations throughout the city, and I will say, consistently something that is still, very painful for me to witness is the extent to which, kind of consistently throughout a lot of AAPI families and communities, there still is a lot of, growing pains and, internal family difficulty dealing with broadly with questions of gender, right? Whether we're talking about having more, what from I think a lot of times a youth perspective would be more emancipated forms of or ideas of what gender expression would look like, or when we're talking about gender identity or sexuality. And it's a space in which I have to say I have not seen as much growth as I would like to from the time I was a child, working through a lot of those issues, in my own family, and working through looking at now and seeing how some of the youth of today, whether they're in, elementary school or middle school or high school, and they're working through some of those issues with their family. So much comes from the relationships that we have with our families. And I've been in conversation, especially with so many API women, and we all talk about the relationships we have with our mothers and how affected we are by those relationships. And, and as I think about like some of the things that we have to do, generally, what are some of the changes we make? I also really query what are some of those changes that we can help make internally in our own families or in our communities. Like how many fantastic, API advocates or activist people do I know that still have this area within their personal space with their families of having these challenges and talking about issues like this. So I would, I'd love to hear from other people too, but I think that we have to be able to move the needle more than we have on what our own internal family and intergenerational struggles have been, not just on issues of gender, but that I think that's a huge one.
I think in terms of what may be missing or what can maybe help fill the gaps for certain conversations or people around their own learning is I've actually benefited from the thinking, the learning, the writing of from the disability justice movement, in particular. API folks, Nia Mingus and Stacey Milburn Park, who have many different types of writings around this conversation about how do we have these hard discussions? How do we bring people in? How do we think about accessibility in our language? How do we think in accessibility in our resources, which I think is a part of the conversation for how we can bring more folks in to our movement spaces. So I just want to uplift that for folks who may be watching, and just definitely check them out as a part of filling those gaps.
One thing to add on to what Carmelyn and Lolan is saying is from the home, from our individual, from our communities, but also looking at our organizational organizations that we're all a part of, that we work with, especially for community-based, if we're doing a lot of grassroots work. What does our structures look like? How do our structures dismantle racism? How do our structures dismantle patriarchal ideas or ideologies? How are we supporting our staff? How are our policies? How do our ways that we're promoting or uplifting our staff body, our client body, how does that playing out? And how are we sometimes knowingly, maybe unknowingly, subconsciously, consciously playing into some of the structures of patriarchy, structures of white supremacy within the constructs of our organizations? And what does that look like? And what does dismantling that look like? Because for me, I think Womankind has been doing this work for 38, 39 years at this point. And I think we're trying as much as possible to be anti-oppressive, but that is an ongoing work. that's ongoing work, and it's something that we're learning. We're unlearning some behaviors, we're unlearning some strategies and some tactics that we've used in the past. But are we willing to constantly be humble in learning and continuing to learn? And what are other organizations also doing? As we do coalition work, we work with CACF a lot. What does our coalition work look like? And how are we dismantling together, and how are we deconstructing these different forms of isms that exist on a community level, on an organizational level as well?
Well, I saw Deepa's hand up as well.
I mean, if there's time. Is there?
Yeah.
Okay. I was going to say a couple of things. I think that what our movements need include the ability to build together beyond these crises moments, right? So the ability to actually come together to have some rigorous conversations that might bring up a lot of generative tension, not destructive tension, but generative tension that we need to work through. A way for us to actually learn about each other, to eat together, to hug each other, to build joy together, to build, as Blakely Boggs has said, those critical connections, right? In the spaces between us. I think that's a critical thing that we need, because many of us are in crisis response constantly. I think we also need to build entryways and pathways for young folks who are joining our movements to be able to get the skills building that they need to find their political homes. And I think that that's really critical, because more and more young folks, I think, are joining various social movements. And it excites me to think about where our communities will be a decade from now. And then lastly, I also think others need to do some things, right? I think that it's important for, funders and influencers to actually step aside a bit, right? And to do their part. So if you're a funder, you should fund. If you are an influencer, you should actually center people who are doing the work, right? Instead of speaking for them. And so I think that it's really important to recognize that movement leaders in the AAPI community are doing just fine. They need a lot more support and spaces and all these other structures and funding, but other folks might want to step out of the way and center them more. So sorry to get a little feisty at the end there.
Shots fired at influencers. Kala.
I felt like that was a lot of radical love and an invitation for influencers. I think one thing that is necessary, and I feel like really has been missing in movement work because of patriarchy, because of white supremacy, because of colonization, is a healing justice framework. Healing justice are the survival and resilience strategies that Black and Indigenous feminists have built. I mean, everyone has read the Audre Lorde quote, that self-care is a form of self-preservation. Sorry, excuse the phone in the background. I think we need more emotional safety and security work that is being done within our communities. The last year has been extremely traumatic for all of us. And in order for us to be able to have sustained movements, especially for folks that have been doing the work for the last 351 days since George Floyd was murdered. I mean, I know people in New York City who have been out on the streets. As a street medic, I saw my comrades, continue to be re-traumatized by the violence of the state. Here in Minneapolis, there are so many amazing and powerful Black and Brown organizers who are just so tired. So if there are any funders or anyone that has connections to resources, utilize those resources to support movements, organizers, and organizations that are doing the frontline work, because we are tired. We are so, tired. And that is how this white settler colonial state works, is it drives us into the ground. And the only way that we can resist is by loving one another more fiercely than the state hates us, by centering joy and really being about rest. How many times have our friends burnt out around us? How many times have we burnt out? We need to have more healing justice in this work, and not just a martyrdom complex that comes from like the old form of social justice.
Sasha.
Yeah, that was very well said, and just very brief things to add to that. I think And I said this earlier, like we also just need more of us. So everything that folks have said already is true, to center the people doing the work on the ground, to get resources to folks that have already built the analysis and the infrastructure and the membership to actually fund those organizations. And we need more of us. And so I think I said this earlier, but like analysis, power trumps analysis every single time. So analysis is important, but I think sometimes in especially Asian organizing, we get really hung up on saying the right thing and saying the right thing and saying the right words and making sure we get it exactly right. And sometimes that actually stops us from building with each other and building relationships and building power. So it's important for us to have good analysis. There's a role for that. It's an important part of our movement ecosystem. But if we have all the right words, but they don't make any sense to people when we go out on the street and talk to folks, it's not actually that useful. And so I think, one last thing, one way our movements need to adapt is to actually prioritize building power over getting all of the words exactly right all the time.
Vanessa.
I just wanted to add, because folks have also brought up young people. And I would acknowledge that in certain spaces like New York City, where we have a highly immigrant community. So like I'm a child of immigrants, and the majority of folks are immigrants or children of immigrants, that we are often not encouraged to share our stories. And oftentimes we're expected to be grateful for being here, and not actually encouraged to talk about what those struggles are, what those challenges are, and ask those questions that can actually increase our racial literacy of our place. Because oftentimes when this country talks about race, it is often spoken in Black and white terms, and we often sometimes don't know where Asian Americans fit in that. So I think there is space for knowledge and growth and easy on-ramps for our young people, but also for others in our community to gain a better understanding about that, and then be able to connect to groups who are looking to kind of change systems, support, address the needs that folks and actually encourage folks to kind of connect to the organizations that are providing those the services and the supports that they may need, that oftentimes they may not realize are available to them.
Yeah, I love that. And hopefully those of you who are watching, especially if there are funders out there, please support these organizations, follow the lead of people who are already doing the work. I think one thing that I just want to be mindful of time, but this has come up in quite a few questions, the pace of everyday life, pretty dispiriting sometimes, the news cycle, the scenes of violence. What's one thing that you've seen, one thing you've read, one thing you've been a part of that offers a sense of hope or that sustains your work? It could be something you've read, something you've witnessed, something you've been a part of. But what's one thing that's really sustained you and offered a sense of optimism in this moment?
I can go first.
I was afraid no one had an answer.
No, it's been on that. So CAAAV is part of this group called New Yorkers for Racially Just Public Schools. And in New York City, we, despite what we think is such a liberal city, we are in a very segregated school system. And education becomes a very difficult topic oftentimes for the Asian American community to unpack. But the power that we've brought together, young people, educators, parent advocates, activists, and policy folks around this idea that we need to transform our systems, that we need to center educational decisions on those most marginalized, and understand that that's those marginalized students include our Asian American students, that are not seen in often these dialogues around around educational justice. So being part of that and having them work with us to present a solidarity rally that addresses this moment around how do we see the model minority myth, the perpetual funner, other harmful stereotypes of our community as tools to maintain divisiveness, that we push back on that and that we come together across communities of color to really demand that our schools can be transformed.
Awesome. Lolan.
On the real, like I'm a burned out OG, and so I've been in the past few months, like actually in this, how do I heal myself and my body from like years of just like nonstop. And I think one of the things that actually lifts my spirit is the Radical Monarchs. It's a group of young folks of color out of the Bay Area in the spirit. Basically, it's like a radical brown, like Girl Scouts for young folks. There's a documentary on them called We Are the Radical Monarchs. And it's just literally seeing the next generation coming together and being supported by adults in their lives who like want to see them flourish. And there's political education, there's like actual like organizing that is happening, and it's actually one of the salves of my heart. So check it out.
That's super cool. Radical Monarchs. Kala, give us something hopeful.
At the start of this pandemic, I think all of us saw that there was that the state left us behind. I live in Jackson Heights, Queens, and I saw my neighbors being carted from Elmhurst Hospital into from body bags into refrigeration trucks. And from that, we saw mutual aid groups rise up. We saw people who cared more about their neighbors than the state cared about us. And I think what we are seeing is that we are recognizing that we are the ones that keep us safe, that we are the ones that actually have the solutions. I want to invite folks to read Mutual Aid by Dean Spade and Beyond Survival, Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement by Wijeyeratne, because we are constructing a new world together. If there's one thing that's very clear, is that the old world is dead. White supremacy, capitalism, and colonialism are crumbling right now. We can almost hear it, feel it, and taste it. We can definitely see it. And together we will win. Together, we will be building a better world. And I think that we have the tools, at our fingertips, and we have the drive. We just need to be able to get to that point together.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Deepa.
So one thing that I've been inspired by recently is a project that I've had the luck and fortune to work on. It's a project that is archiving solidarity stories from Asian American and Pacific Islander community leaders. And so it includes a short video clip, and it includes a reflection guide that has a case study in it for folks to discuss. And so just hearing about and interviewing and learning about, the LA Uprising or Filipino-Mexican labor organizing, the fight to stop the construction of a telescope on Mauna Kea, how Japanese-American elders stopped, Fort Sill from being a holding camp for children separated from their family members. All of these stories are part of our histories, are part of our lived experiences in our communities, and they're also charting out our possibilities for the future. So I've been really inspired by that. It's called, the website, it'll be live next week if you're interested in checking it out, is solidaritystories.org.
Awesome, that's super cool, solidaritystories.org. Other folks?
I have the handy immigrant family inherited trick of, relying on the children in the family as a source of constant renewal and hope, because you know, I often wondered how my family did it and my mom did it with so many struggles. But, you know, our children are really a source of so much newness. And the other day, the other week, my 4-year-old asked, you know, what misogyny was, because he hears it constantly since I work at home. And I explained, and at first he was like, well, why did they ruin the word massage? And then I went a little deeper, and then his next question was, well, you know, well, mommy, who was the very first misogynist? And I feel like in this space that I'm in, that's suffocated by liberal feminism, that's like, you know, we're never going to get out of the male gaze. I hear it all the time. We're never going to really end this. Like, we've forgotten just that basic idea that this started through a process, a historical process, and can indeed be ended through a similar process. I don't know who the very first misogynist was, though. I'm still working on that one. But anyway, yeah, I rely a lot on my children.
That's absolutely incredible, the massage thing. Sasha?
I will keep this very quick because I realize we're over time, but recently, especially, I think watching the resistance in Palestine and especially the joy in resistance in the face of just like such like barefaced state repression has been really inspiring, and also both inspiring in the moment, but sort of thinking through how to fight for your, like, over your lifetime and many lifetimes.
We have time for a couple more, if any, or we could, Carmelyn?
I'll just add in, I think, you know, a lot of the ways that we are talking about reimagining community safety, mutual aid, a lot of these things are not considered radical anymore in the public discourse. And in fact, you know, again, I'm so focused right now because we're here in New York City. There are elections coming. Like, candidates have to talk about these things. If they do not include discussions of these issues in their campaigns or in their imagining of the future New York City, they're not going anywhere because they're being called to account for these very real things. The fact that they're not radical anymore, they're not fringe, they're front and center, I think is incredibly exciting, at least from where I'm sitting.
I totally agree with everything everyone is saying. And one thing, prior to coming on today, I watch a lot of TikTok to kind of unwind. But one of the things that I heard on TikTok today was solidarity and the power of love amongst communities of color is more powerful than any divisiveness of racism. And unfortunately, I cannot contribute to the person who I heard this from, but that spoke volumes to me. And it spoke volumes to the history of communities of color coming together, working together, coalitioning together, and kind of navigating every system of oppression that has been out there. And I think we will continue to do that. And it'll always be a part of our fight and a part of what we are gonna do to continue to uplift love.
I'll just add that participating in this and hearing all of the unbelievable work everyone's engaged in is really lifted me up, and it's sort of given me quite a bit of hope. And, you know, those of you who are out there, you know, if you're interested in any of these issues we're talking about, you know, just know that you're not alone, and know that you've never been alone, and that these histories have always been there, and that we are part of this lineage, and it's up to us to figure out what solidarity work means in your own life. Maybe that just means being a good neighbor, holding yourself accountable, holding your family accountable. But, you know, for all of the terminology, for all of the sort of like larger structures, like a lot of it does begin with just being humane and thoughtful to one another. And, you know, I'm just so grateful for the panelists, Nancy, for organizing all of this. Please tune in on Thursday. This was today. Thursday is the future, and Thursday is the future panel as well. And there will be subsequent panels looking at policy, looking at culture. Bookmark, if people still do that, quietbefore.com. And thank you so much to everyone, to all the panelists. You know, I can hear all the applause out there. And, you know, thank you to all of you for spending your Tuesday evening with us, or afternoon or morning, wherever you are. Thank you.